Well, thank you for joining us this lunchtime for this ESCO Economic Measurement webinar. My name is Rebecca Riley, and today we'll hear from Jakob Schneebacher of the Competition and Markets Authority about their recent very comprehensive exploration of competition and market power in UK labour markets. At the CMA, Jakob is based in their research-focused microeconomics unit, which is going from strength to strength. Jakob was previously working at the Office for National Statistics and the University of Oxford, and he has collaborated on several ESCO research projects with colleagues here for several years now. Jakob will present for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have comments from Hannah Slaughter of the Resolution Foundation. She's a senior economist there, focusing on labour markets and has been involved in their Economic Inquiry 2030, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So thank you very much for joining us, both of you. Before handing over to Jakob, just can I say, please, can I ask that you put any questions you have during the presentation into the Q&A. If you just type them there, we'll be able to see them at our end. We will have, after Hannah's discussion, we will have time for Q&A, and I'll basically ask you to raise the question yourself. We unmute the microphone at this end. I also need to mention that this webinar is being recorded and will go live on our website after the event. Over to you, Jakob.
Thanks, Rebecca, for having me. Thanks, Hannah, for taking the time to discuss. And I just want to say it's nice to see a lot of familiar names in the attendance list. So let me share my screen. Can everybody see this? I assume that's a yes. Okay, so this seminar is based on, as Rebecca mentioned, is based on our recent CMA report on competition and market power in UK labour markets. This is joint work with my phenomenal co-authors, Anna Rincon-Desnar, Joel Carriol, Nicole Schultz, and Max Reed and Rini Sharana. So just a little bit for context, I guess, why labour market power. I mean, I think it's fair to say that labour market power has had a bit of a resurgence recently. I think a well-deserved resurgence in economics. Just three data points to support this. I mean, one is David Cart's Nobel Prize. In his Nobel lecture, Cart mentioned that it's time to recognize that many, if not most, firms have wage-setting power, which is a very standard assumption we make in product markets, but maybe less so in labor markets. On the back of the revolutionary work by Card and others like Alan Manning, there's been an academic resurgence as well. There's been a lot of recent work, especially on US labor markets, showing rising labor market power in manufacturing, but also more broadly across the economy. Over the last maybe 2 or 3 decades or so, and sort of at the same time, some work around the negative effects of labor market concentration for mostly worker outcomes, although in some cases, I guess beyond worker outcomes. That ranges from the sort of cross-sectional or panel regressions between labor market concentration and wages to more carefully identified work that uses merger events to show that, especially for workers that have few outside options in local labor markets, the effects can be quite substantial. And on the back of all of this evidence, the US competition authorities have just revised their horizontal merger guidelines to, for the first time, really allow for the possibility to intervene in in merger cases on labor market grounds alone, even if there's no consumer harm. Okay. Now, obviously, for UK audiences and policymakers, this begs the question, what about the UK? And this is where our report comes in. So it's an attempt to bring together quite a few bits of evidence around labor market power and the effects of labor market power across different types of data sets and methodologies, and with the aim to explore how labor market power interacts with some of the other policies in labor markets. So just to give you a quick preview of the results, there's basically four things I'd like to highlight. The first is that as opposed to the US, labor markets or labor market power in the UK has been pretty stable, if anything, slightly declining in recent decades. So to me, this highlights the importance of country-specific evidence, especially in labor markets where the institutional arrangements are so important. Secondly, while overall there is no change, there are significant and quite persistent differences across labor markets. So that's geographically, but also by occupation and by industry. And for those workers who are affected by concentrated labor markets or who are facing employer market power, they have measurably worse outcomes, particularly in terms of their wages. So there's a real cost to labor market power, even if aggregate levels are quite low. And then finally, technology and the various institutional aspects of labor markets interact with employer market power in complex ways. I think that's another call not to unthinkingly apply intuitions from product markets where maybe some of those institutions are absent. So those are the high level findings. So let me give you a bit more detail on each of those. So this is a seminar on economic measurement. So let's start with the basic question of how much market power is there in UK labor markets. We have essentially used two ways of measuring labor market power. Both are quite standard in the literature. We have I'll show you first some results on labor market concentration. And so this is maybe an older measure of labor market power. The idea is, if workers face fewer options, then employers are able to lower the wage for those workers. And then I'll show you our evidence on wage markdowns, which is a more direct measure, perhaps, of labor market power, but it comes with some estimation complications or assumptions you have to make. But as you'll see, the picture is quite consistent across the two. Okay, so before we jump to the results, I promised there are only two slides on methodology, one on concentration measures and one on wage markdowns. So let's talk about concentration measure first. So if you want to talk about concentration in the labor market, the first thing you need to do is to define the labor market. What we have done as a baseline in the report is to define a labor market as a travel to work area by a 3-digit occupation code, right? So the intuition there is that workers are geographically relatively immobile. They don't travel very far for jobs, and they face some frictions if looking at jobs that require quite different skills from what they have. But we don't make any restrictions in this baseline case in what industry workers are working on. So to make this more concrete, if you are an accountant in Manchester working in a manufacturing business as an accountant, we think it's unlikely that you will move to Norwich for work. We also think it's unlikely that you retrain as a nurse, but we do allow you to work as an accountant in Manchester at an accounting firm. You can, of course, play around with other work definitions of the labor market. And one thing that's quite encouraging is that when we do that, the results don't change very much. And the trends don't change at all. And the levels shift a bit, but are still quite comparable. The second thing we have to think about is the difference between concentration in employment and concentration in vacancies. Now, obviously the two are related, right? I mean, vacancies are flows that lead to the stock of employment, but they are quite distinct. And unfortunately, there isn't a consensus of how to relate the two in the literature, or even at what interval job vacancies are best measured. So again, we'll show a variety of measures in the report. And the good news is the results don't seem to be all that different. So we have employment data from the annual survey of hours and earnings, which is sort of more stable and maybe conceptually closer to how we want to measure labor market concentration. And then we also have so since about 2012, job vacancy measures from web scrape Lightcast data. There are a couple of other advantages and disadvantages between the two. You know, the ASH is a micro sample, and that might potentially bias our concentration measures. There's previous work by Willa Bell, Silvana Tenriero, and Greg Thwaite that shows that in practice, this bias is likely small. Lightcast data is, in principle, the universe of online job vacancies, but you know, web scrape data comes with its own set of issues. Okay, now once we have a market and we have a measure of employment, then the last thing we need is a way to measure concentration. And here the literature, and we follow the literature, essentially takes an analog from the product market side. We compute concentration as the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So that's the summed squared market shares in the labor market, right? So to give you an intuition of what these numbers mean, if we're in a perfectly competitive labor market, market shares are essentially zero, so their summed square is also zero. If there's a single firm in the market, so monopsonist, then they have a market share of 100. So the squared market share is 10,000, and that's the HHI for the whole market. The convention among competition authorities is that 1,500, an HHI of 1,500 denotes a moderately concentrated market, and 2,500 denotes a concentrated labor market. Okay, so with that in mind, what does the UK look like? So here are the last 2 decades, roughly. You know, we plot the mean and the median labor market concentration measure. So we take all of these labor markets, trouble to worker by SOC 3, we compute the HHI, we weigh them up by employment, right? So it's representative of the typical worker. We show you the mean and the median. The mean is higher. This means there is sort of a longer tail of more concentrated markets. But even the mean is sort of below the definition of a moderately concentrated market, and the median, in fact, is around 600. Both of them are trending slightly down until the pandemic, and then jump a bit and seem to have stabilized again. So that's the aggregate picture. When we look at concentration, we can also look at wage markdowns. Now, what's a wage markdown? Well, let's take a step back. If we look at product markets, the way that economists working in this space measure market power is with the so-called price markup, right? So the price markup is the difference between the price and the marginal cost. Why is there a difference between price and marginal cost? Well, this is exactly market power, right? So a firm with market power is able to extract some of the surplus from consumers. Wage markdowns are essentially an analog to that. They measure the difference between the wage and the marginal revenue product of labor, right? So this, you can think of this as the marginal contribution of the worker to the firm's revenue. If the wage is below that, then the firm is capturing some of that surplus, and that's an indication of market power. Now, how do you estimate wage markdowns in practice? So you do that from production data, because we don't observe marginal costs, right? But you can back it out from a firm's production decision, and the price markups can be measured either using labor as the relevant input or materials, and the wage markdown is essentially the ratio of the two, right? So the markdown captures how much more market power is inherent in the labor markup compared to the materials markup. And for both of those markups, there is a very standard procedure to compute those, although there are intricacies over how best to estimate them in practice. They always feature two elements. One is the firm level cost share of the input you're looking at. This you can observe from firm level data. The other one is an elasticity that needs to be estimated. This is sort of where all the dark magic lives, and we can talk about some of the choices we make. I can show you, actually I'll show you on the next graph, that across different estimation choices, we get qualitatively quite similar results. And that's, I think, all I'll say about the estimation methodology now, but I'm very happy in the Q&A to dig into the details if there's interest. Okay, so what does the picture look like? Again, in aggregate, this is the markdown over the last 15 years or so. We show you here in dark blue our baseline choice of methodology, and in light blue some of the other choices that I think are also defensible. We've standardized the levels of all of these markdowns to 100 for the beginning of the period, just so we can see the trends more clearly. And you can see that different approaches give you slightly different answers, but in general, markdowns have been falling slightly, with maybe perhaps a bit of an uptick at the end. And again, this is weighted up by employment to be representative of the average worker. Okay, so on average, market power has been stable or slightly declining. What can we say about differences across markets? I think the first dimension worth looking at, as is often the case with UK economic data, is geographically. So here I'm showing you vacancy HHIs. The reason is that in our version of the ASH, we don't have Northern Ireland. So this just allows us to look at the whole of the UK, but I can show you the employment HHI measures afterwards. In both of them, you see that levels are much lower in London and the south east than in the rest of the country. And labour markets are particularly concentrated in Scotland and Wales. Now, you might ask yourself, has this changed over time? So the answer is yes, we do observe a bit of movement across some of the labor markets, but not in a systematic way. So there is the concentration levels haven't changed in a systematic way across space. Okay, what about occupations? So we'll come back to this, I think, in a little bit later. But here is the picture. Again, the report and the appendix, if you're interested, have lots and lots of finer breakdowns. But I thought we'd just group here blue and white collar professions. So what you can see here is, again, this is from the vacancy data, but the picture is very similar for employment. White collar concentration is broadly stable. Blue collar concentration starts out a bit higher than white collar concentration, but has been falling steadily over the last 10 years or so, and is now below white collar concentration. Okay. This is concentration. We can look at the markdowns as well. Again, broadly stable across broad industrial sectors, falling in services, and you'll see that the lines in services across the different approaches disagree somewhat more. I think that's because of methodological reasons. I think it's just harder to estimate markdowns in services. And again, very happy to pick this up in the Q&A if anyone is interested. Okay, so we've seen that in aggregate, concentration and employer market power have been stable or slightly falling in the UK. There is persistent variation, geographical variation, occupational variation, sectoral variation. Now let's look at worker outcomes. So the standard in the literature, and we sort of follow this here, is to look at the association between the concentration in the labor market the worker is facing and the wages they receive. Right? And I'll talk a little bit about how we control for things, but just sort of as a first picture, what I'm showing you here is a scatter plot of the relationship between pay and labor market concentration at the worker level after we control for all sorts of firm and worker characteristics, as well as the usual time, industry, and region fixed effects. Right, and so what you see here, we've binned the scatter plots. I think we have about 3 million observations. We've binned the scatter plot just to make the picture a bit easier to read. But what you see is the higher the concentration, right, the further you are towards the right on the x-axis, the lower the pay. Right? So that's we find very similar results to what people have found in other countries. Now, if you split the data up by whether a worker is covered by a collective bargaining agreement, it's the same regression as before. Now, with this additional collective bargaining agreement into action, you see that actually the relationship is much flatter and is statistically insignificant for workers that are covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Right? And this is also consistent with prior literature around countervailing bargaining power in labor markets. Right? So where workers are facing concentrated labor markets, a union may balance out that bargaining power on the other side of the labor market. Okay, so a little bit more detail on what's in those regressions. So I've we've plotted here the coefficients, so the elasticity between concentration and the wage for different specifications, right? So from the top to the bottom, we add more and more controls, and we start out with just year fixed effects. We add in sort of high-level industry controls, finer industry fixed effects. We add in worker controls such as education, experience, and so on. We add in firm controls for productivity. We add in worker fixed effects. So this is to say, we only estimate this relationship within the same worker from changes in concentration and wages over time. And then finally, in the last two regressions, we add in this collective bargaining control and this collective bargaining interaction, right? So that gets you to the regression that represented by that last scatter plot that I've showed you. And generally, once we control for two-digit industries, the elasticity is very stable across different controls. Okay, so this is all to say wages at the worker level are robustly negatively correlated with concentration. Yeah. Now we can estimate this relationship year by year, right? And so it tells us something about the effects of concentration on worker outcomes over time. And when we do that, we see that over the last 20 years, the relationship has weakened considerably, right? So the elasticity goes from minus 0.04 to about minus 0.01. It becomes statistically insignificant, right? So one way to read this graph with all of the previous results that you've already seen is that concentration hasn't changed, but the markdown and these time varying coefficients here suggest that for a given concentration, employer market power has weakened, right? So why is this? I mean, this is sort of a little bit speculative. This is all just aggregate time series relationships. You really, we would want there to be better identified work to distinguish these relationships. But just some impressions from the result from the report. So one hypothesis in the literature is that the reason employer market power has increased in the US is because unionization rates have fallen, right? So the flip side here would be if employer market power has fallen or stayed stable, maybe it's because unionization rates have increased. We don't find any evidence of that. A second hypothesis that's been advanced in the literature is that the minimum wage can counteract employer market power. And I think that's something to be taken seriously. The national minimum wage has been expanded quite considerably over the last couple of years. So here's one graph to maybe put some additional context here. If we look across low, medium, and high concentration labor markets, and we look at the rollout of the national minimum wage, so we look at the share of people that are covered by the national minimum wage, we see that most of that increase has been in low and medium concentration labor markets rather than high concentration labor markets. Okay. And then finally, and I think this is sort of at least a strong candidate. So this is related to recent work by Aaron Dube and David Autor. Strong labor markets in themselves can shift labor market power towards workers. The UK has seen tightening labor demand. So there's a couple of ways you can make this point. In the report, we also show the labor leverage ratio, which is essentially the relationship of voluntary quits to involuntary firings, right? So that's another measure of the labor market strength. Here I'm showing you the labor market participation ratio, right? So this is just roughly essentially the share of people that could be working that are working, and you see that this is increasing over time, and it's high by the standards of comparable countries. So I think that's a very plausible candidate, but as I say, there's much more work needed in this space. Okay, then let's sort of shift to the last set of findings, which is about the many ways in which labor market institutions and labor market policies can interact with labor market power. So here, this is just to round out this section on worker outcomes, some work we did to replicate a recent paper by Jose Azar and Diana Marinescu and co-authors, where they look at the impact of minimum wages on employment for different levels of labor market concentration. And the idea is that, the canonical theory is that the minimum wage, by raising the price of labor, will lead to a reduction in employment. However, if you already have distortions in the labor market because of employer market power, that might balance out some of this effect, and that's what Azar and co-authors are finding for the US. This is also what we're finding for the UK. So what we're showing here is that in both high and low concentration labor markets, the relationship between employment and the share of workers covered by the national minimum wage is negative. But that slope is much flatter in highly concentrated labor markets. Okay. Now, I think I'll just maybe flash this slide, and we can come back to it in the Q&A. But I think one thing to point out is that there's a lot of things we don't know. So to compute, so one of the things we might be interested in is whether labor market power resides in the same firms and in the same industries that also have product market power, right? That's important for enforcement. It's also important because it has implications for whether worker and consumer interests are aligned or not. As we point out in the report, this really depends on what you think about the relative input market power in labor versus material input markets. Both of those are very active research areas. I think the emerging evidence is suggesting that both of them face pervasive market power, and that makes it tricky to assess some of the answers we need for policymaking. Okay. So I'll have maybe 6 or so minutes left. So let me just round this out with some of the work we did around emerging trends in labor markets and how they interact with labor market power. So we focused in the report. We focused on 4. We focused on the gig economy. We focused on restrictive covenants, which are employment clauses that hinder worker mobility. We focused on the impact of working from home and hybrid working, and finally on pay setting policies and how they affect inequality within the firm. So let me just show you a few of those results. So as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, we've seen a huge explosion in hybrid working. So we confirm this with our vacancy data. The rate of jobs that are hybrid jumps from around 3-4% before the pandemic to 20%, and sort of seems to have settled around 18% now. One thing to point out is that if we look where these jobs are located, a big majority of hybrid jobs are concentrated in the least concentrated labor markets. Now, we haven't controlled at all for sort of the types of occupation and industries, so this might well be just a compositional effect. We just note that more work needs to be done. We also show that this rise of hybrid working comes with a sorting across space. Researchers have called this the donut effect in the US. We see something similar here. So people move from the city centers into the surrounding areas. Again, there's more maps in the report if you're interested. So what does this rise of hybrid working mean for workers? Well, here are two ways of looking at the impact on workers. The first one is to note that areas that have seen an increase in working from home have also generally seen an increase in median earnings over the pandemic. The second is to look at self-reported willingness to pay. And so this is from survey data by Paul Missen, an ESCO deputy director and co-authors, that suggests that people are on average willing to pay between 5 and 10% of their salaries for the option to work hybrid 2 to 3 days a week. So this is on hybrid work. What about the gig economy? So the gig economy, is from a competition in labor markets perspective quite interesting because it's a digital platform on which people contract their labor services. So it plays into both concerns about labor market power and about large tech firms. We use survey data, so this is Understanding Society, to show that for sort of a narrow definition of the gig economy, gig work is still only about 4 to 5% of overall employment in the UK, though somewhat rising. This contrasts to sort of wider measures of casual work, which hover around 10 to 12%. We also show that while earnings in the gig economy are comparable to the traditional economy, although with sort of a larger left tail, gig workers work long hours. So here we see the distribution of total hours worked per week. And you see for traditional workers in the dark dotted line, that's clustered around just under 40 hours per week. But for gig workers, we see many working many more hours. And they also tend to have multiple jobs. So there is this insecurity aspect to it. It's also reflected in the movement across the income distribution. So gig workers tend to be more mobile. Again, the report has the comparable chart for the traditional economy, and it suggests that gig workers move up and down across the income distribution more frequently than traditional workers. For a minute on non-competes, and then I'll wrap up if that's okay. So non-competes are employment clauses. So this is a contract between the worker and their employer. So this is not in the purview of competition law, but it has implications for labor market power. We present some of the first evidence on the use of non-competes and other restrictive covenants for the UK. We show that they are quite common. I mean, if it depends a bit whether you ask workers or firms. If you ask workers, around 30% of workers claim they have non-compete, and it's widespread across different sectors. The sort of two arguments for and against non-compete are usually that having a non-compete allows a firm to provide training without the worry that the worker will immediately leave. So somewhat supporting that, we find that workers with non-competes receive slightly higher formal training. So this is the graph on the left. But they're also, in self-reported survey data, they're also more likely to say that they have been prevented from either leaving to start a competing business or to join a competitor. So that's probably a good point to wrap up. So what the report does, I think, is across a variety of measures builds the evidence base on UK labour market power. I think it really highlights the importance of UK-specific evidence to make UK policy. And for us, it's the starting point for more targeted follow-on work. And then, I'll just conclude with some open questions. Maybe some of you in the audience will be inspired to pick some of those up. So with that, let me just point you to the report, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jakob. Can I just remind the audience to feel free to add any questions they have in Q&A, and we'll take those after we hear from Hannah Slaughter.
Right, thank you so much, and thanks Jakob for a great presentation and a great report. It was really interesting read. Hopefully you can see my screen. I will assume you can, unless someone shouts at me. So I thought for my response I would kind of give a bit more kind of thoughts on the kind of the worker side of that balance of employer and worker power. I mean, Jakob's presentation focused largely, not entirely, on the kind of employer side and market concentration. But as part of our work at the Resolution Foundation, along with the Centre for Economic Performance at LSE, in our Economy 2030 inquiry, we've done some thinking about kind of that overall balance as well. So just to kind of bring some of that into the discussion too, as well as the policy side. I mean, one kind of basic way that you can think of workers having power, and this is something Jakob alluded through in his presentation too, is that kind of a strong labour market should improve workers' bargaining power. And here I'm just showing the unemployment rate. Jakob showed the participation rate and mentioned other measures that you can use, but on most measures that we think of, we've had periods of quite a tight labour market. On some measures right now and before the COVID pandemic as well. But it's also clear that this isn't enough to make a kind of a big difference to workers' outcomes. So this chart here is just showing the growth in real hourly earnings at different points in the pay distribution, and you can see that there's been some pretty strong growth at the 10th percentile, so thanks to the national minimum wage, but at the middle of the distribution, so this dark blue line here and the kind of teal line, which is the 90th percentile, it's very much a story of stagnation. And so if employer concentration, for example, has stayed roughly stable and wage markdowns, if that's not kind of, if it's not on the employer side where kind of movement has been happening, is there stuff going on the worker side, or is it just a stable but a kind of relatively poor outcomes for workers picture that we're seeing? So one kind of particularly pertinent form of worker power kind of collectively is trade unions, and again Jakob highlighted it in his presentation, the important interaction between the collective bargaining mechanisms that we have in place and counteracting employer concentration where it exists. And this chart is just highlighting the share of workplaces, slightly larger workplaces with 25 or more employees that recognise unions, and this is showing that probably unsurprisingly to most people, that share of unionized workplaces has declined over time, and there's lots of reasons for that, changes in the labour market and wider society over quite a long time period. But what this chart also makes clear is that it's kind of younger firms, so less than 10 years old we use here, where the decline has really taken place. So it seems like unions are struggling to get a foot in the door of newer firms. And what that means is that if kind of collective bargaining has become kind of less prominent in the labour market, that means that individual worker power becomes more important in counteracting any kind of employer power that exists. And the first chart I showed, we have a tight labour market, that there are options out there, obviously notwithstanding the fact that labour markets across the country look really different, as again Jakob's highlighted. But there are other ways in which actually the picture might not be quite so rosy for workers. So in one example, this chart is showing the share of workers who do training to prepare for a job they might do in the future, which has been declining at least since around 2010, when we have data back to on this measure. And there's also an argument that with rising rates of atypical and insecure work, the options that are out there for workers are getting less attractive, particularly for low-paid workers who are more likely to be on these contracts. So, it's maybe harder to switch jobs, and you're also less likely to want the jobs that you could switch to if you're a worker, kind of irrespective of employer market power. It's also getting costlier for workers to lose their jobs. So you might think the ultimate kind of outside option, the kind of ultimate fallback option, is to leave your job entirely and look around for another job from unemployment. But here we can see that unemployment benefits as a share of earnings, so the replacement rate that you get if you lose your job, has been declining over the longer term. There was a slight uptick around the pandemic because of the £20 a week uplift to universal credit, but by and large, unemployment benefits have been becoming less generous. And that's actually even more true if you're a higher earner, because it's a flat rate of unemployment benefits, so you lose more, but it's not much for anyone to live on. So that's becoming kind of less of an option too. And then the final thing to highlight is that we're obviously in a time of prolonged economic uncertainty, and we know from a variety of pieces of evidence that in those uncertain times, workers are more reluctant to take risks. And here's just to mix things up a bit, is a quote from a focus group we ran just over a year ago, where a worker said was reflecting on whether they'd move to a new or better job, and they said, I think it's a bit of a difficult time to change into a new job. Do you risk changing when you've been in your job the whole of COVID and not lost your job? Do you risk going into a new job, a new probation period and everything, when you can't afford to lose your job right now? It's a risk, so you stick with what you know. And we've heard this in a lot of focus groups as well. It's kind of makes sense in the quantitative evidence too. That this, and again, I don't think anyone would need convincing of this, especially having had Jakob's presentation too, but this is having real world consequences. So declining worker power means that even if employer market power doesn't change, that the relative balance of power is tilted towards employers. And also, even if neither of those things are changing, the kind of steady state is very much one of employers having power over wages. So we estimated in a report a couple of years ago that employer power could be depressing wages by as much as £100 a week, relative to a world in which employers had no power over workers. And that was using the kind of lower bound of academic estimates at the time of the wage markdown that might exist. And I think that's consistent with the evidence in the CMA report as well. So it's kind of, even if nothing's changing, there's still potentially a problem there for workers' wages and living standards. And then finally, just to share some thoughts on kind of what can policy do. And so Jakob obviously touched on some of this in the presentation, the report, in terms of kind of what features of the labour market and interaction with policy are kind of already in place. But in addition to things like putting limitations on non-competes, say, to address employer market power a bit more directly. Some of the ideas that we've had as part of our Economy 2030 inquiry. The minimum wage is obviously really important, and protects the pay of the lowest earners, puts a floor on the amount of power that employers can leverage over their workers, and again, as Jakob's report highlighted, there's interactions there too between the minimum wage and employer concentration. But the minimum wage has been really successful at protecting the pay of the lowest earners, so that's definitely one to continue doing so and being ambitious on. And in terms of improving the quality of the outside options that people have, there's a role for employment regulation there in improving non-pay aspects of work. So we've recommended things in our past work around, for example, putting minimum notice periods on shifts, so employers have to give workers a certain amount of notice before their shifts, and with compensation when there's cancelled, to kind of make sure that that people aren't put off moving by the lack of good jobs out there. Similarly, introducing some form of unemployment insurance, so higher unemployment benefits that are linked to previous earnings would give workers more kind of power to move jobs and take risks, and that again could kind of counteract some of the negative impacts of employer market power. On trade unions, as I said, there's lots of reasons why trade unions have declined, but it looks like there's a particular struggle for unions to get a foot in the door of newer workplaces. So to make sure there's a level playing field there, the government could consider, for example, making sure that unions are able to kind of enter workplaces to raise awareness of workers so that they know their options. And then finally, we've also made some slightly more kind of radical recommendations around institutional innovation, and particularly bringing together workers and employers in particular sectors with kind of acute problems. So we've suggested starting in social care to agree on minimum standards in those sectors to kind of again sort of use institutions to take a bit of a step back from the kind of market dynamics of employer power and worker power, and move towards a more collaborative solution. I think that was pretty much it from me, but I mean, it's a really interesting report, and I'm very glad to be invited to discuss it today.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to both of you for providing such a useful and in-depth view of important labour market trends. And I think also illustrating very clearly what can be done with the UK microdata collected by ONS and others. We're now going to have, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to first turn to Luca Marcolin, and then after that, Rachel Soloveichik. And both speakers, please feel free to address the questions that come up here. I think there's also a question from Bernard Casey, which perhaps we could, Jakob and Hannah, you could address at the same time as Luca's question. Bernard is asking, or is suggesting, that vacancies skyrocketed post-pandemic, and how relevant was this in the context of what you're talking about? Do we have Luca on the line?
Yes, Rebecca, I'm here. Can you actually?
Yes, I can hear you.
Lovely. Great to see you. Great to see Jakob as well. Thank you, both Jakob and Hannah, for your contributions. So my question is fairly specific to Jakob. I mean, you showed this time trend in labor market concentration, at least the median and mean time trends. And as far as I understand, so there is no real uptick during the great financial crisis, while there was a fairly substantial one, if perhaps temporary, during COVID. And that's not how I would have imagined it to go. I mean, at least as far as, if I look at firm bankruptcies, then there were fewer during the COVID crisis. I mean, it looked like basically a pretty frozen labor market during COVID because of state aid. So why such a jump? I mean, did you put some thinking into it? Do you have an intuition for us?
Thanks, Luca, and thanks for the question. So this is, I should say, this is, not the report. This is me idly speculating, and please do not take this as any indications of what the CMA believes. I mean, I think my sense is, so first of all, if you look at the UK data on business exits, I think it mirrors your intuition. So if I had to give an explanation, I think it's it has more to do with the fact that a lot of firms, so the COVID pandemic had very much a labor market impact, and a lot of firms temporarily froze hiring, and I think that's maybe what's reflected in those figures. But that's, as I said, idle speculation. Is it okay if I just respond to 2 points of Hannah's very quickly? I mean,
Yes, Jakob, please do.
okay, excellent. So, I mean, very nice discussion. I mean, the 2 points that Hannah made that I think are really worth highlighting is, the first one is, if you look at wage stagnation, we show in the report as well that, in the long term, wages can only rise when productivity rises, right? And so there is that is an issue that has to be addressed. The second point is on mobility, and again, we have a little bit about this in the report that I wasn't able to show, but I think that's a very good point, that mobility and the outside options is really what gives workers a lot of power in the labor market, and so to the extent that there are frictions, this will constrain what workers take home.
Thank you. Hannah, did you want to come in on this at all, or shall we move to Rachel Soloveichik's question?
Nothing really to add on this one. Yeah,
Okay.
we've moved on to Rachel's.
Rachel, are you on the line?
Can people hear me?
Yes.
So this is an amazing presentation. You really demonstrated that market power matters. I'm just wondering if you ever thought of splitting it by demographics, because they tied workers, maybe less mobile, and maybe immigrants, maybe more mobile, and that would have all kinds of fun instrumental variables maybe for people.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I think we sort of saw this report as a bit of a starting point of our work on this. So the focus was really to replicate some of these studies that have been done elsewhere for the UK and really draw out this broad picture. But as you say, I mean, there's a lot of variation in labor markets, and that's on our agenda. And we have a couple of follow-on projects that hopefully will be fruitful.
Yeah, if I can share some thoughts as well. I mean, some of the things that we've heard, I mean, this is particularly in qualitative research we've done. We've not done a huge amount looking at it quantitatively yet, but some of the groups that are kind of particularly affected, we've heard people with caring responsibilities, particularly people with children, often have effectively smaller local labour markets because they need to be they might need to be within a certain distance of their kid's school, or be able to kind of get to someone's house to look after them at a moment's notice. So that can be quite difficult. If you have again caring responsibilities or health conditions that limits the kinds of jobs that you're able to do, that can also lower your power in other ways. We've also heard quite a lot that travel time can really make a difference. So that availability of public transport, whether or not you're reliant on a car, that kind of thing can really affect the power that you have, just purely because of the jobs that you're able to take. And then on the migrant worker point, I think one group that I would highlight is people who are on say visas that are tied to their jobs, and obviously they have almost no ability to move jobs, and that can really diminish their market power. So that's a group to be potentially more concerned about as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think it's time now to wrap up, but thank you for your participation, your questions in particular. Thank you to Jakob and his CMA colleagues for this interesting work and for taking the time to talk to us about it, and also to Hannah for her additional perspective on the topic, which has been very helpful as well. Before you go, I would like to just advertise our next ESCO Economic Measurement webinar. This is taking place next week, so next Thursday, but it's a little bit later than it has been today, so it'll be held from 1 o'clock till 2 o'clock, and I think that's because that was the time slot that fit in Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States all at the same time. And at that seminar, we'll hear from Shitaksa Dongde at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She'll be talking about measuring multidimensional hardships during the pandemic in the US. Thanks again to our speakers.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.